Hello, I'm Chris Welzel, and it is my pleasure to give this keynote lecture to the 50th anniversary of the International Association of Cross-Cultural Psychology. My lecture is under the title, Why the West is So Weird, the cool water theory of global cross-cultural variation. Well, as most of you know, our point of departure is a widely noticed article by Schultz, Henrik et al., a couple of co-authors, in Science, in which they emphasize the features that distinguish Western civilization from other parts of the world. The authors pinpoint the distinction under the terms educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And if you get these capital letters together, you get the English word weird, supposedly also saying that this is the smallest segment of humankind on which most of psychological studies are based, and we're drawing conclusions to humanity writ large based on these weird samples. That has been questioned already before, especially by Joseph Henrik, and I recommend his recent book on weirdness. Strikingly, these authors claim that the West's weirdness originates in the medieval church's ban on cousin marriage, a typical custom throughout agrarian civilizations in history. According to Schultz, Henrik et al., the ban on cousin marriage is a baffling singularity of the Western branch of the medieval church that implanted into Western thinking an individualistic egalitarian orientation. We contrast Schultz et al.'s portrayal of the West with an alternative narrative provided by what has once labeled evolutionary emancipation theory, EET, if you abbreviate it. Due to EET, the West's weirdness roots in a deep-seated emancipatory drive that directs societal development towards liberating outcomes that free people from external domination over their lives and existential constraints on their lives. Indeed, we argue that ever since the Reformation, constant struggles, not always successes, but constant struggles for equal entitlements, rights, and opportunities, in a nutshell, human empowerment, define the pulse of Western civilization. Our theory, however, defies the idea that the medieval church's marriage doctrine sowed the seed of the West's emancipatory drive. Implicitly, we think the church thesis advocates a view of history that is, in a profound sense, mythical, for it leaves in the dark why only the Western church and no other religious institution pursued with vigor an exogamous marriage doctrine, and why this doctrine met no resistance among populations that supposedly practiced opposite marriage patterns until then. Against this view, we report studies indicating that indeed the Germanic tribes populating Europe's northwest pursued exogamous marriages already in pagan times. Moreover, we present evidence suggesting that the reason for this marriage pattern resides in ecological features typical of Northwestern Europe's cool water climate. That is, the combination of cool seasons with the ubiquity of fresh water and its derivative resources, like valuable land. Hence, we advocate an ecological explanation that traces the West's emancipatory dynamic to the environmental conditions under which Western civilization, and especially its Protestant branch, evolved. I'm going to share my screen right now. Here's the cover slide of my talk. So our reasoning proceeds along a sequential logic of 5 steps. First, at the outset, every natural habitat embodies its mixture of geoclimatic challenges and opportunities. Second, to cope with these, certain psychological orientations are more useful than others. For instance, in habitats whose ecological risks are largely predictable, long-term rather than short-term time orientations benefit people's livability. Third, variability in the utility of psychological orientations guides reproductive success of these orientations in family and peer socialization. Hence, the more useful orientations become more firmly encultured. Fourth, the once encultured orientations operate as a selective force that predisposes people to find appeal in those ideologies which express their implicit predispositions most explicitly. Fifth, once encoded in lasting institutions, ideologies place populations on inert trajectories that continue to differ in their slopes of progression, thus magnifying cross-cultural variation over time. In reminder, I proceed as follows. In the argument section, I describe our environmental configuration of emphasis, the cool water condition. Second, I explicate the mechanism through which the cool water condition is supposed to trigger emancipatory societal dynamics. Third, I enter the results section by demonstrating how distinct Western civilization is in terms of the cool water condition. Fourth, I show that global variation in the cool water condition explains, for one, the West's post-industrial progression towards human empowerment, and B, the pre-industrial initiation of the human empowerment dynamic by the West. Fifth, I refer to an extensive set of robustness tests that validate this evidence against Schulz et al.'s Western Church thesis. I close with a discussion of the implications of those findings. Our study includes some supplementary online materials, which is available on the internet. In case you're interested, I can provide you with the link. So what the cool water condition is. The cool water condition constitutes a thermohydrological constellation that prevails in particular natural habitats of our planet. The thermal component of the cool water condition consists of mildly frosty winters and cool summers. The hydrological component comprises continuous rainfall throughout the seasons and the ubiquity of fresh water sources. Geographically, these features vary by degree, and so we combine them into a continuous CW index for different kinds of spatial units as detailed in our supplementary online materials. In the Northern Hemisphere, the cool water condition is most pronounced in Northwestern Europe, the coastal north of the United States, the coastal south of Canada, the Great Lakes area in North America, and somewhat less alongside stretches of Northeast Asia around the Korean Peninsula and Japan. In the Southern Hemisphere, the cool water condition characterizes smaller and more isolated territories. To a lesser extent, we find it in the south of South America, the very southern tip of Africa, the southeast of Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands in the vicinity. Obviously, the geography generating the cool water condition is the combination of coastal proximity with high absolute latitudes inside the Earth's plant growing zone. Now, why should this condition be important? The cool water condition embodies a mixture of geoclimatic challenges and opportunities that direct people's orientation, psychological orientation, towards productivity and autonomy. Considering the thermal component of the cool water condition, cool seasons mean a productive challenge. They force people to prepare for seasonal change, which necessitates industriousness to provide and maintain clothing, housing, heating, food, storage, as well as the tools and technologies required for this purpose. Outdoors, coldness mandates activity to stay warm, while indoors, creativity offers an escape from a welcome escape from boredom. Although these ideas are as old as Montesquieu, if not even older, recent evidence confirms their validity, showing that, quote, bad weather makes good productivity, as one journal article claimed. In short, low seasonal temperatures favor productivity as a value. As concerns the cool water conditions hydrological component, continuous rainfall, the continuous rain and the ubiquity of springs, brooks, rivers, ponds, and lakes makes fresh water an openly accessible resource. Because of the ubiquity of fresh water, land is usable for fishery, forestry, hunting, pasture, or grain cultivation almost everywhere. In creating an environment of open access resources, the cool water condition reduces the possibility to monopolize assets, thus setting a limit to the power of elites over land and people. In as far as the landed nobility emerged in agrarian cool water areas, the evolving form of feudalism was contractual rather than coercive, implying a less exploitative master-servant relationship. At any rate, the point is that original autonomies in water access create derivative autonomies in settlement, land use, work organization, and household formation. As a species equipped with agency, humans value the autonomies that circumstances play into their hands. Therefore, seeking to protect autonomies becomes a more potent driver of human striving when people have more autonomies from the beginning. So, one of the elements that we attribute to the cool water condition is individual resources. So how does this work? Well, in being productive and autonomous, people accumulate means and skills under their own control. In short, this is what we call individual resources. This tendency unfolds in the context of the cool water area's propensity to sustain the nuclear rather than the extended type of family. There is growing recognition that the nuclear type of family constitutes an early manifestation of the West's emancipatory drive. Already at pre-industrial times, nuclear families involve consensual marriages, high marriage ages, especially among women, combined with a low age distance among married couples, two instead of multi-generational households, and the absence of lateral relatives like uncles, aunts, cousins, and so on. Nuclear families are typical of prehistoric forages and horticulturalists. But among the mature agrarian societies of the pre-industrial age, nuclear families are unique to medieval northwestern Europe, the agrarian region back then with by far the most pronounced cool water condition. By implication, this means that the cool water condition favors the preservation of the nuclear type of family throughout the transition from foraging to agriculture. The reason is that the kind of cultivation suitable to the cool water condition, namely cereal planting like rye and wheat, combined with cattle herding, allows nuclear households to farm large stretches of land on their own with little need for child labor, supported by extended kin, or hierarchically coordinated cultivation management. Supporting this depiction, there is credible evidence that the Germanic tribes inhabiting Northwestern Europe's cool water area lived in nuclear families early on. Indeed, in his description of the barbarian Germanic tribes, the Roman writer Tacitus portrays indeed a lifestyle that includes all the key features of the nuclear family. Where nuclear families prevail, women marry late and have a say in whom they marry. This constellation exhibits a certain degree of female reproductive autonomy. Sure, before the invention of modern contraception, female reproductive autonomy was limited everywhere. Nevertheless, relative differences existed already in pre-industrial times. They reflect varying ecological pressures to maximize fertility. The cool water condition, which is one of our main claims, emits lower such pressures to maximize fertility for several reasons. Among hunter-gatherers, fertility pressures are limited anyways, irrespective of the natural habitat. This is so because the mobility of a foraging lifestyle sets limits to the number of infants with which a tribe, a group can roam its habitat. Besides, foraging involves low labor requirements compared to agriculture, which means the absence of pressures to increase the workforce through maximized fertility. And even though labor requirements generally increase with the adoption of agriculture, different types of agriculture come with variation in labor intensity. To be specific, labor demands are highest under cultivation methods that necessitate hierarchically coordinated irrigation. Hence, the type of natural habitat becomes significant in that precipitation patterns determine to what extent hierarchical irrigation management is useful. The cool water condition is critical in this respect, not only because steady rain eliminates collective irrigation needs, also the grain growing, cattle herding type of agriculture favored by the cool water condition allows nuclear family households to farm sizable land areas on their own, implying a low demand for workers per area unit. Logically, lower labor demands reduce fertility pressure. Another source of lower fertility pressure are environments that naturally harbor fewer diseases. Since the prevalence of diseases like malaria, yellow fever, dengue fever, bilharziosa drops alongside cold winters and rainier summers, the cool water areas are, relatively speaking, less disease burdened than tropical, subtropical, and arid regions. Before the Industrial Revolution, infant mortality depended on an area's natural disease burden. Accordingly, the cool water conditions' lower disease burden reduces natural rates of infant mortality. Therefore, people can afford lower birth rates to sustain their bloodline and the needed labor supply. Again, this means lower pressure on women to invest all their fertile lifetime into bearing and raising children. Lower fertility pressures, for their part, avoid kinship patterns tailored entirely to maximize male control over female sexuality, which is the essence of patriarchy. The autonomy of nuclear families as production units shields farming households from collectivization pressures. In turn, such autonomy eases the accumulation of individual savings, and reduced fertility pressures free up time to acquire individual skills. With cattle herding being an important element in agriculture, people eat more meat and develop lactose tolerance to digest nutritious dairy products. Taken together, these factors make farmers better equipped, skilled, and fed, which reduces mortality. Also, because ecological threats against which there is little protection, such as droughts, floods, tropical storms, and heat waves, are less prevalent in cool water areas. For these reasons, the cool water condition contributes already in pre-industrial agrarian settings to higher incomes, lower fertility, better skills, and longer lives. We summarize this combination as individual resources. Evolutionary psychology characterizes the same principle as long in contrast to short life histories. This juxtaposition reflects the polarity between quantity breeding and quality building in reproductive investment. Biology addresses this polarity in fertility behavior as the difference between R strategies, which is rather quantity breeding, and K strategies, which is quality building. The polarity roots in ecologically induced differences in fertility pressures for the reasons outlined. Greater individual resources are thus a manifestation of the cool water conditions naturally lower fertility pressure. I speak to another element that we attribute to the cool water condition. This time it's not individual resources. Now we're talking about an institutional feature, civic entitlements, human rights. Starting from nuclear families, an emerging social order is less dominated by hierarchies and instead harbors a multiplicity of autonomies, including personal, local, corporate, and sectoral autonomies. Switching to the second slide here, so you see a little bit of a depiction of the whole logic here, simply in conceptual terms. So this is not an empirical figure. Anyways, medieval Northwestern Europe showcases this principle that the society is infused with autonomies rather than hierarchies, which is not to deny the occurrence of a feudal rank order. Also in Northwestern Europe, of course, kings ranked above dukes, dukes above lords, and lords above peasants. But in the absence of standing armies and state bureaucracies, the instruments to enforce this chain of command were rudimentary. Therefore, the kind of feudalism emerging across Northwestern Europe's cool water areas was, as already mentioned, of the contractual rather than the coercive type. For farming households, this means lower tributary obligations than elsewhere and better chances to get rid of them. Besides, there always was a considerable percentage of peasants who were personally free, which for urban dwellers held true anyways, given the medieval city's self-government. In any case, the multiplicity of autonomies under the cool water condition sustained pluralistic power-sharing arrangements in which social groups coalesce through voluntary agreement. Sororities, fraternities, Freemasons, artisan crafts, merchant guilds, and trade leagues, combined with local town hall meetings and village assemblies, shaped a decentral social order composed of a myriad of social entities each experienced in self-organization and coalition building. Interestingly, scholars find that the prevalence of autonomy orientations in a population today is weaker when the respective region became agrarian earlier in history. That is, the original adoration of autonomy that seems natural to foraging tribes begins to fade at the moment a population adopts agriculture. The reason is that as agriculture matures, fieldwork becomes more labor intense and valuable land increasingly scarce. Land scarcity and labor intensity mandate then an authoritarian management of space and people, hence the loss of autonomies. In Europe, agriculture diffused from the Fertile Crescent into the southeast toward the cool water areas in the northwest. But throughout northwestern Europe's cool water area, autonomy orientations remain strong despite a considerable agrarian history. Appendix figures S20 and S22 show this very clearly. Evidently, the Northwest's cool water condition exempts agriculture from the need of collectively coordinated irrigation and its subsequent conformity pressures. Free from these conformity pressures, nuclear families retain their existential autonomy in the transition from foraging to horticulture to agriculture. Hence the persistence of autonomy orientations. Consistent with this point, farmers in Northwestern Europe benefited from lower feudal obligations than elsewhere and were able to get rid of this burden earlier and more completely. In some of the cool water heartlands, like Friesland, Scandinavia, and Iceland, feudalism actually never surfaced. As soon as the medieval barter economy began to monetize in the 14th and 15th centuries, rulers sought to levy taxes on the prospering bourgeoisie. But under Northwestern Europe's cool water condition, monarchs faced a multitude of self-organized social groups experienced in collective action and coalition building. Precisely this experience involves know-how in coordinating effective resistance against over-ambitious would-be despots. For this reason, royal absolutism was at best temporarily successful in Northwestern Europe and has eventually been terminated through the liberal revolutions of the 17th and 18th century. This way, state formation took a unique course. Unlike the coercive orders that prevailed everywhere else in the world where states emerged, the state in Northwestern Europe evolved as a contractual order, exemplified in the Boston Tea Party slogan, "No taxation without representation." The signature feature of the contractual order is that it checks executive power by elected assemblies. Political representation exercised by these assemblies has tailored government to work for the electorate's common good. This common good tradition infused into populations a civic spirit that lasts until today, visible in figure S21, visible and also in figure S18, trust in strangers, figure S19, public engagement, and figure S20, support for equal freedoms, so impartiality. Sure, in the absence of universal suffrage, the contractual order is not yet a democracy, not in the modern sense of the word, at least. But it embodies the potential to evolve naturally into a democracy in parallel with the gradual extension of taxation and other civic obligations like military service. The franchise has been extended to until universal suffrage widened the electorate to include the entire adult population, with all individuals holding the same civic entitlements. The human impairment versus empowerment model in Figure 1 summarizes this cool water theory of societal development. Results. If you look at Figure 2, Figure 2 uses a historically grounded scheme of Western and non-Western civilizations or culture zones, as we have detailed in the online appendix section 2. The figure demonstrates that the cool water condition is exceptionally strong in the 4 groups of Western civilization, yet especially in its Protestant branch. Indeed, the Germanic and English groups of the West, where Protestantism prevails, exhibit a visibly more pronounced severe cool water condition than the Romanic and Slavic groups, where Catholicism is dominant, historically speaking. Still, even in the Catholic branch of Western civilization, even that branch harbors a substantially stronger cool water condition than most of the non-Western world. By all means, the cool water condition is the West geoclimatic signature. The cool water areas of Northwestern Europe represent the first and for a long time the only civilization to industrialize and democratize. But why did the indigenous people in the cool water areas of the New World not pioneer this development? The answer is straightforward. The first humans conquered the cool water areas of the New World much later than those of the Old World, and they lived in isolation from major agrarian civilizations, which foreclosed an early transition towards intensive forms of farming and the subsequent launch of an industrial revolution. Indeed, the indigenous populations in the cool water areas of North America, think of the Iroquois, South America, think of the Mapuche, as well as Australia, think of the Aborigines, and New Zealand, think of the Maoris, still pursued a foraging horticultural lifestyle upon first contact with Europeans. Living at a pre-agrarian stage, these populations were at a dramatic disadvantage to prevail in confrontation with an endless influx of farmers from Northwestern Europe. The consequence was the indigenous people's decimation, discrimination, and marginalization. Against the backdrop of this colonial tragedy, European settlers were free from the yoke of a feudal aristocracy, which helped placing the New World's cool water areas onto an even more speedy industrial democratic trajectory than Northwestern Europe itself. It is noteworthy, though, how the indigenous peoples in the New World's cool water areas lived before colonization. Checking my time. Sorry for this interruption. All right. So most exemplary, the people of the Iroquois Federation of Nations close to the Great Lakes lived in gender egalitarian family structures and under consensual decision-making in their federation. More generally, data on pre-industrial tribal populations from all around the world provide systematic evidence that living in cool water areas, whether in the Old or the New World, involved more egalitarian family structures, less exploitative local hierarchies, and more consensual forms of government. On that appendix section 8.3 provides the evidence. Had North America's cool water areas been populated 30,000 years earlier than Northwestern Europe, rather than the other way around, the West's industrial democratic dynamic might well have been initiated by the Iroquois or some other North American tribe, finalizing the transition into full-scale agriculture. Now, I have to cut a long story short, and figures 3 and 4 show you that indeed the cool water condition explains, using human empowerment, encompassing human empowerment index as the dependent variable, that the cool water condition is predictive of post-industrial levels of human empowerment, but already of pre-industrial levels of human empowerment when that whole dynamic started to kick in. And what we see also in those figures, because on the right-hand side, you see the evidence under control of the Western Church exposure. It turns out that Schultz and Henrich's Western Church exposure is insignificant as a predictor of emancipatory outcomes under control of the cool water condition, while the other way around, the cool water condition retains its explanatory power over emancipatory outcomes under control of the Western Church. In fact, our analyses show that the variability in the Western Church exposure is very well explained by the cool water condition, which tells us, or gives us an sort of an elegant explanation why the religious revolution known the most for its individualistic egalitarian impact, the Protestant Reformation, was most sweeping, most successful, and most vibrant in exactly the cool water regions of northwestern Europe rather than in Mediterranean Europe. To conclude, we see, however, that, and this is the final figure 6, no one is really happy with geographic determinism. What we see is that the correlation of the cool water condition with emancipatory outcomes, whether we look at individual resources as an emancipatory outcome or civic entitlements as an emancipatory outcome, this correlation is continuously shrinking over the last 120 years. Year by year, it goes down a little bit. And it's related to the globalization of individual resources and civic entitlements, because you see those orange lines that are increasing, and in parallel to this, the cool water conditions correlation with emancipatory outcomes is going down. So this tells us something about diffusion dynamics that might be triggered by processes of globalization, cross-cultural learning, and more. The good news, however, here is that societies seem to be liberated more and more sort of from the grip of geography and can achieve desirable outcomes in terms of human empowerment more at their own choice through policy learning, for instance. With this, I will close here. And I hope you found that interesting. I'm looking forward to the Q&A session that will happen then live, so to speak. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found that stimulating. Bye-bye.